So good morning everybody and welcome to this high-level event which obviously has attracted great interest, and I'm very happy to see that the room has very fast filled in and has become too small immediately. There is also, I think, live broadcast so that everybody can follow the presentations and the discussions that we're going to be having here this morning. Welcome to this high-level event, which is co-organized by the Ministry of Economy and Business of Spain, the European Commission, and the European Investment Bank. I am extremely pleased that we have been able, amongst the numerous events that take place around the COP25, to bring together an incredible group of speakers representing important institutions, all of them committed to working together to fight climate change and move forward the environmental transition. Thank you for being here in Madrid. We are all concerned about climate change, which is one of the most important global issues on the political agenda of our time. A recent study by the Universal Ecological Fund found that of the 184 pledges made by countries under the Paris Agreement, only 36 are ambitious enough to help reach the goal of keeping global warming less than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Most of these 36 pledges were made by countries of the European Union. So the world is heading in the right direction, but we are behind schedule, and we need to speed up our response to act urgently and with more ambition. We need to use scarce public resources better, to mobilize private investment for these fights. Without public investment and private investment, we will not succeed. We need to make sure that the voice of the young people is heard, that we leave no one behind in this transition. Finance has a key role to play, and this event is precisely going to focus on this, with two stellar international panels and a fantastic expert, and let me add, communicator, Nicholas Stern, for the concluding remarks. And now I have the great honor to introduce our guest speaker, Michael Bloomberg. Mr. Bloomberg really needs no introduction. He is an entrepreneur, 3 times mayor of New York City, an innovator in government and philanthropy, a global leader on climate change. He also, anecdotically, announced just a few days ago that he will run for US president in 2020 as a candidate for the primaries of the Democratic Party, which may explain partly the interest that your presentation has raised. It is a great pleasure to have you here today. As I said a moment ago, amongst many other things, he is a climate leader, an advocate, an activist. As mayor of New York City, he implemented a groundbreaking strategy sustainability plan and reduced carbon emissions by 14%, positioning the city as a model for climate action around the world. He has given $1 billion to initiatives to combat the climate crisis in the US and around the world, and has worked with 2 UN Secretaries General to accelerate local and regional action, serving in different positions. I'm not going to enumerate the many initiatives you have led. Just mention a couple of them. When the Trump administration announced its intent to withdraw the US from the Paris Agreement, Bloomberg stepped in to build the We Are Still In coalition of now nearly 4,000 US leaders who remain committed to these goals. He launched the America's Pledge initiative with California Governor Jerry Brown, bringing together cities, states, and businesses to keep the US commitment to cut carbon emissions. This year marks the 3rd consecutive year in which Bloomberg will fund a US presence at the annual UN COP summit. And building on the Beyond Coal campaign, he recently launched Beyond Carbon, the largest ever coordinated campaign to fight the climate crisis in the US, which aims to retire all carbon coal plants by 2030 and stop the construction of new gas plants. We were just discussing this a moment ago. He also works to involve the financial community in fighting climate change, serving in very different positions as chair of the task force on climate-related financial disclosures, etc. His presence today at COP25 in Madrid is another expression of his commitment with the climate change agenda. Thank you very much for your engagement. Again, thank you for your presence here today. And before proceeding to your opening remarks, let me give the floor to Vice President Dombrovskis, who also wants to say some words on your collaboration with the European Commission. Thank you.
Very good, thank you.
Honorable Minister Calvino, dear Nadia, first of all, thank you for organizing this event today, and indeed we see it's attracting lots of interest. Honorable Mr. Bloomberg, dear Mike, I'd like to thank you for being with us today and for having accepted to participate in this event. As an UN Special Envoy for Climate Action, you had been a catalyst in bringing cities around the globe together and getting them to team up in the fight against climate change. Your leadership and support for sustainable finance policy has been critical in terms of drumming up support and critical mass to make real change possible. In particular, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures has a huge transformative role in terms of scaling up sustainability corporate disclosures. The European Commission has integrated these TCFD recommendations in our guidelines on reporting climate-related information. I would also like to thank you for lending your best experts to the European Commission's European Commission's expert groups. I believe that by acting together, we can make a real change. Once more, thank you for your leadership on climate finance. I hope we continue in the same spirit in the future. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Buenos dias. And thank you all for coming. And I wanted to particularly thank Minister Calvino and Executive Vice President Dombrovskis for their introductions. They were not needed, but they were certainly appreciated. You could have gone on a little longer. That was funny. You're supposed to laugh at that. And for all the work, thank you, that you're both doing to help tackle climate change. And I think we also owe a big thanks to Prime Minister Sanchez of Spain and everyone on his team. They really showed a lot of leadership in agreeing to host this summit on short notice when Chile was unable to do that. It's not easy to assemble a global event so quickly, and they really have done an outstanding job. And we're all in this together, and that spirit of international cooperation will be the key to victory in the fight against climate change. Let me also thank European Investment Bank and President Werner Hoyer for the work that they are all doing, leading on climate finance, as everyone from the European Commission knows. It's great to be here in Madrid and to stand alongside Americans who are committed to working with our partners around the world to fight climate change and the climate crisis. The group here includes city and state leaders, CEOs, and nonprofits. Unfortunately, it does not include a representative from the White House. For the third year in a row, the Trump administration declined to fund a U.S. presence at the UN Climate Summit. And each of those years, I'm proud to say, Bloomberg Philanthropies has been happy to step in and fill the gap. Here in Madrid, we built a small pavilion to highlight the work that the United States cities, states, businesses, and citizens are doing to fight climate change, just as we did at last year's summit in Poland and the year before in Germany. When President Trump cut funding for the UN Climate Office, Bloomberg Philanthropies, if you remember, stepped in to fill the funding gap. And when President Trump decided to pull the United States out of the Paris Agreement, Bloomberg Philanthropies joined former California Governor Jerry Brown, who incidentally asked me to send his best wishes to you. He's sorry he couldn't be here. We asked Jerry to help bring together thousands of mayors and governors and CEOs and community leaders. And together we've all said, we're still in. So even though the United States government has pulled out, that does not mean that America and the American people have done that. We're committed, and we're going to stay committed. We named our group America's Pledge, and later today I will present a new report It outlines the progress the United States continues to make despite the lack of leadership in Washington and what we can do to speed up that process. And I do want the world to know that Americans are continuing to work on climate change, even with a climate denier in the White House. And one of the things that's fascinating is we have been closing coal-fired power plants at the same rate during the Trump administration that we did during the Obama administration. So the White House matters, but sometimes not too much. And we can, if we have to do it without it, would be much better if they were in. But even if they're not, we're not going to walk away from our responsibility as citizens of the world to do something to save everybody's lives. Our biggest obstacle is not technology. We already know how to power buildings with sunshine and wind. We already know how to power cars without oil and gas. We already know how to strengthen cities against severe weather and rising seas. We're doing all of those things. We're just not doing nearly enough, and that's why we're here today. The real lesson is, as I said a few months ago in a commencement speech at the University Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the problem, as in so many cases, is not science, but it is politics. Governments and business are not investing enough to phase out fossil fuels. They're doing some, but not enough. Reduce carbon emissions, the same thing. Protect the future of the planet. Yes, we're saying the right things, and we're actually doing some of it, but certainly not enough. And that's the big problem. The good news, however, is we can fix it if we all pull together, face the fact that it's not enough, and say we're tired of just talking about it. You look on television, you see the fires in California. Look on television, you can see 4 feet of rain in Texas in one day. Look at the droughts where there used to be floods and floods where there used to be droughts, and you see something really is changing. The farmers will tell you their crops are growing differently. They plant at different times of the year. They can plant different things. Something is changing, and we have got to do something about it. The fact is, investments that help fix the climate crisis can also generate returns. So we can make a case to everybody, not only do you have to do it to save your lives, but it's also in your short-term economic interest. And investors are eager to make them, but there are obstacles standing in the way. It can be a lack of reliable data or consistent standards, or a lack of a credit rating, which prevents a lot of cities from raising funds, especially in developing countries. The capital is out there. We just need to unlock the capital. And I think we can do that by knocking down these kinds of barriers. Now, the EU has been a real leader in this work. In October, it launched the first global framework for sustainable finance, and it will do a lot of important things like aligning standards across markets. The countries that have signed up account for almost half of the world's GDP and half of all carbon emissions. More countries should follow their lead, including the United States. That's not likely to happen under our current administration, but businesses understand what's at stake, and they are not waiting for better leadership in Washington. And to help more of them take action, Bloomberg will host a meeting of the International Platform for Sustainable Finance in the United States in the months ahead. At the same time, climate change poses risks to virtually every industry, and every CEO wants to reduce those risks. The more companies know about risks, the faster they can act. In the past, they haven't had good information, which has slowed their response to business risks, which has slowed our global response to climate change. Now, Mark Carney from the Bank of England started an effort to fix that, called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD. He asked me to lead it, and I was glad to agree. Our group wrote up a set of recommendations to help businesses better measure their vulnerabilities. And there's let me give you a couple of examples of the kinds of vulnerabilities that companies might face. For instance, a company might have a factory near the water that is in danger from rising sea levels. Or a company's business model might be heavily dependent on fossil fuels, which are being phased out by clean energy. Fossil fuel companies have tried to hide those liabilities, which inflate their value, but put shareholders at risk. In the United States, public companies are required to provide information about their financial health in annual filings to the Securities and Exchange Commission. They're not required to disclose all the risks they face from climate change, and the vast majority, sadly, do not. We need the next president to work with Congress to change that. Our countries have taken similar steps. In fact, around 900 companies, governments, and financial institutions in America have signed on to support TCFD guidelines. Together, they are responsible for more than $120 trillion in assets. And I'm glad to say that this year, the EU has adopted TCFD guidelines for climate risk reporting. And thank you for those of you that did it. Thanks in part to Executive Vice President Dombrovskis in particular. We've been a friend for a long time, and you really have come through on this one. Thank you. My company, Bloomberg, was founded, as many of you know, on the idea that better data leads to smarter decisions, more investments, and a stronger economy. The TCFD that Mark Carney started is based on a very similar idea. And I will say that Mary Shapiro, who works for Bloomberg Philanthropies and was the former SEC commissioner in the United States, is leading both of these efforts. She and he showed a lot of foresight and leadership on this issue, and so it's fitting that Secretary General Gutierrez has just named Mark Carney as Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance. Last year, the SG asked me to spearhead a new effort called the Climate Finance Leadership Initiative, and we pulled together a group of public and private financial leaders. We wrote a report that outlined how you can move away from fossil fuels faster without disrupting economies or threatening people's jobs. And we submitted the report to the UN Climate Summit in September. The bottom line is, beating climate change won't require a miracle. It won't require limitless resources. It will require leadership, and it will require common sense. Now, it's true the U.S. federal government is running a big deficit in the Department of Common Sense, but to be fair, we're not alone. Think about this. Last year, countries provided more than $400 billion in subsidies for the extraction and use of fossil fuels. They were subsidizing people to go and dig up stuff that are just killing all of us. Unfortunately, in this case, you get what you pay for. And right now, we're paying for more fossil fuels, more pollution, more carbon emissions, and we're getting a hotter planet. The next president of the United States should end all subsidies for fossil fuel companies and fossil fuel extraction, and that includes tax breaks and other special treatment. He or she should reinvest that funding into clean energy, which will also create a lot of new jobs. If we take these steps, if we work together, I really am optimistic that we can succeed. We have a good start. We are making progress every day. In the United States, we've closed 299 out of the 530 coal-fired power plants, and most of the rest are scheduled to close in the near future. The economics are pushing the manufacturers of energy that use coal to change their fuel source. And we're going to continue to make sure that happens. If we take the right steps, if we work together, and incidentally in Europe, we've already closed about 70 out of the 325 coal-fired power plants that are just starting to grow there. In the UK, they haven't used coal in a while. Think about that. Remember Maggie Thatcher fighting the coal miners' unions? Coal dominated the EU economy and today does not exist. So we've got to work together. And I really am optimistic that we can succeed and we can leave a better, brighter, healthier future for generations to come. We all depend on you, everyone in this room, everyone at this conference, all of us around the world. So thank you, particularly you two, for your leadership, and all the best. And everybody, I'll be watching, as so will the rest of the world. We have a big responsibility, folks. We can't walk away from it. Thank you. applause.
Thank you, Mike.
This one, yeah? Okay, as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello, hello. Hello, hello. Can you all hear me? Ladies and gentlemen, no? Mike? Hello, hello. Ladies and gentlemen, that's better. My name is Reed Landberg. I'm with Bloomberg News. I'm one of the energy editors in London. I oversee our climate coverage and coverage of the COP. So if there's anything we've written that you're unhappy about, I'm the one to blame. I have to be honest, it's a little bit of a relief to see the boss leave and leave me to get on with things. This panel is about how to get private investors to come up with the finance needed to implement the Paris Agreement. And the bad news is there's a lot of finance that's needed. The International Energy Agency estimates that the world needs $71 trillion in energy systems over the next 20 years to keep a lid on global warming and hit that nirvana where we hit the Sustainable Development Goals as well. That's more than triple the size of the US economy. But as mind-boggling as that figure is, it's actually only 20% higher than the 59 trillion that we'd spend under a business as usual scenario. So 71 trillion sounds scary, but to me, the message is that saving the planet is possible. All it needs is we need to unlock the finance to keep it going. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a fantastic panel for you this morning. We have 3 bankers and 3 politicians, and they all have their own perspectives on how to get finance flowing. First, I'm going to introduce one of them one by one as they come up. They'll give an opening remark for 3 minutes each, and after that I'll follow up with a few questions. I hope we have time for some Q&A at the end. So let's get right into it. The first question I'd like the panel to address is, what is the state of sustainable finance in your institution or your nation? And what can you do to get things moving? I think we'll start with Nadia Calviño, the Spanish economy minister. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, welcome again. Welcome again to all of you. It's a great pleasure to host this panel here in Madrid. And we were very interested to organize an event to discuss in particular sustainable finance because of what the points that he was making, that we will need large investment, public and private investment. In Spain, our national energy and climate plan has estimated 236 billion euros will be needed in the coming 10 years in order to face the challenges ahead. That means that we definitely need to have public investment to fund those infrastructures, the smart grids, and those areas where private investment will not be able to reach. But we definitely need to bring public and private investment together to face this challenge. And how to unlock that? What are we trying to do? And unfortunately, I don't think that there's a miracle wand or a miracle solution that's going to make it. We need to create the incentives, we need to have the right framework, we need to proceed on parallel tracks, and we need to proceed very fast. First, we need to define what is green and what is not green. I think that we absolutely need to avoid greenwashing. And that means that investors need to know when they invest in green bonds or in green companies that there are serious, reliable data that can give them security that they're investing in the right place. I think Michael Bloomberg's presentation was actually very spot on when he said data is the starting point. I think that the EU with the taxonomy, I'm sure Valdis is going to talk about that, is the pillar, the first pillar that we need to define what is green and what isn't. Then secondly, we will need to develop a green bond market. In Spain, the National Development Bank, ICO, the Instituto de Crédito Oficial, already went to the green bond market last year. We are planning to do so from the Treasury next year. A number of local governments and also private companies have already started to tap this market. I think that this is a growing market, but again, standardization and knowing very clearly what we're investing in is going to be key if we want this market to flourish and not to be dead on arrival. And then thirdly, we will need to see how to make the financial sector be interested in investing in this future, in our future at the end of the day. I believe the regulation is going to need to be consistent, but at the end of the day, investors will need to see what's in for them. They will need to see that this is profitable, and therefore we will need to bring many incentives and many elements going in the right direction. It's not going to be easy. I think this is a quite complex program, but the sooner we get to it, the better, and the more it is a global effort, the better, because I think no single country is going to be able to unlock this investment on their own. So we're supporting very strongly national initiatives, European initiatives, the EIB, the European Investment Bank's new approach, global initiatives, and I hope that by next year, when we do COP26, we will see great progress on this regard, because if we don't bring finance together with the climate action, I think achieving those ambitious goals is going to be quite, I wouldn't say impossible, but nirvana-like, you know.
Thank you, Minister Calvino. Our next speaker is Valdis Dombrovskis. He just started his new job last week. He's the Executive Vice President for the European Commission for the economy that works for the people. He also works as a Commissioner for Financial Stability, and he's held that post for 3 years. He was the Prime Minister of Latvia from 2009 to 2014, and a Finance Minister before that.
Madam Minister, ladies and gentlemen, as regards climate change, Europe aims to fully play its parts fully as regards fight against climate change and lead in a way of implementing a Paris Agreement. And from that purpose, climate change is right at the top at the agenda of the new European Commission of von der Leyen. And actually, tomorrow we will publish the European Green Deal to make Europe the world's first climate-neutral continent by 2050. So we put ambition high in our European Green Deal. It will protect our environment. It will increase investment in most competitive technologies and give also people better quality of life. But fulfilling this ambition will not be cheap. It will require massive levels of investment, especially from private sector. So Europe was the first region to legislate properly on sustainable finance. I hope that this will inspire other regions too. And just now we are in final stages of reaching an agreement on an EU classification system to define which economic activities are sustainable. When agreed, this will be the single most important piece of EU legislation on sustainable finance so far, because it will create common language on what qualifies as green and sustainable investment. It will help then investors, industry, policymakers to identify green investment opportunities. And we will see this as a basis for EU Green Bond Standard and EU Eco-Label for retail financial products. And I believe that this new green standard will change investment flows towards green, and we do hope that it will become a global standard. Next year, after consulting widely, we'll present an updated green financing strategy. On sustainability reporting, we will propose regulatory changes for companies to provide information on their sustainability risks and opportunities. We will explore standards and labels for other financial products, such as green loans and mortgages for energy-efficient housing. And last point I wanted to make is that Europe cannot do this alone. If the world moves together, we can move faster. This is why we recently launched International Platform on Sustainable Finance. It is open for any like-minded country to join, and I'll call on all countries represented here today to do so. So thank you, and I look forward for the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Dombrovskis. Our next speaker in the middle is Werner Hoyer. He's in his second term as president of the European Investment Bank, one of the banks that's done the most to support the energy transition. Before that, he served 2 decades in the German Bundestag and was a member and did a number of government positions in Germany, including twice as a Foreign Office Minister. Mr. Hoyer.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And before I start, let me thank our Spanish hosts for setting up this conference. I've talked to Patricia Espinosa and told her in the future they should not decide about the allocation of a COP 1 year or 2 years in advance. 4 weeks is enough, and it works, and it's perfect. So thank you very much for your hospitality and the fantastic preparation. On substance, this day made it for me because I happened to cooperate with Mike Bloomberg for a long time in the context of the Global Covenant of Mayors and also with Bloomberg Philanthropies. It's a real pleasure because I know that he's going to deliver. And this is important. For this conference, for this COP25, he is the beacon of hope from the United States. And we need the United States on our common effort to cope with climate change. So it is really very welcome guests here at this conference. Very, very encouraging. On substance, well, it's a little bit strange for us at EIB. For decades, we are the biggest, not only biggest multilateral bank, but also the biggest climate financier. But nobody noticed it. So at COP21 in Paris, we committed to 25% of our lending to climate projects, and we have delivered more. But now that we have announced that by 2025 we commit 50% of our lending, and that by 2030 we will have triggered $1.1 trillion of climate action with our projects, we are all of a sudden center stage. And it's a little bit unfair vis-a-vis those of us who have done that in the last decades, but it's great to see that because I think we can move something. We can move something in the financial community. And I think we will see others following this trend. From a purely banking point of view, beyond my climate conviction, it is simply necessary to say you don't, as a serious banker, invest in assets which you know have a lifespan of 45 years, but you know you need to write them off after 15 years. So this is something that no commercial bank would do. You don't invest into soon-to-be stranded assets. And therefore, we have taken this decision. We have produced some frowning in some member states on this, of course, and we need to help those who have the biggest problems with it. I mean, our biggest commitment is that we help those regions most affected by it, because the coal miner in some pit in southern Poland will not turn to be the head of a digital startup in 2 years. So we need to help this transition. That is the biggest challenge for the European Union. Final word on green bonds. We invented them 12 years ago. We found out quickly that without standards, common principles on green bonds, we'll see a huge ocean of greenwashing. I'm very grateful to the European Commission, led by Valdis Dombrovskis, that we now get some order into this. Order in Greek is tax. So that's a pretty bad word, but taxonomy is needed. We need to have accountability, clarity, and transparency on the issuance of green bond, just as we need that for sustainability awareness bonds, which is going to be the next stage, because we all know you can forget about the sustainable development goals if you do not attract the private sector as partners.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Boyer. Our next speaker is Axel von Trotzenberg. In October, he took up his post as Managing Director of Operations at the World Bank. Before that, he held a number of vice president posts, once overseeing Latin America and the Caribbean, which is a great hotbed for clean energy finance. He was country director in Mexico and Colombia, and a manager on the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, and also worked at the OECD in Paris. Mr. von Trotzenberg.
Well, good morning, everybody. I think Minister Calvino already explained that we currently, unfortunately, are talking about the billions of dollars of financing available. Well, we need trillions. So there is a clear issue about the dimension how we address this. And this problem is worst in the developing world. And here we will need to see how we can help and assist developing countries to meet this challenge. So therefore, external financing will play a very important role, mainly private financing. So we will need to create better conditions that these investments occur, but also of public finance. At this stage, the external financing for climate-related investment in developing countries is around 600 billion. And we need, as I said, trillions. So there is an enormous amount of scale-up to be done. Now the tendency is that everybody points to the other who should finance it, and one forgets oneself. And I think actually one should start by oneself. So what is the World Bank Group doing? Well, first, over the last 10 years, we have committed about $120 billion. This is nice, but it's not enough. And so the ambition was, how do you scale this up? Now, how you do that in the World Bank is partly so capital increases, be it for the public sector arm or the private sector arm, or for the window for the poorest countries, IDA, to get more money mobilized. And the good news is we have been able to mobilize on score of capital increases as well as for IDA. And this means that our ambition till 2030 is to provide $335 billion in financing related to climate. Now that is good, but I think as everybody realizes this is only one part in a bigger picture. The multilateral development banks currently represent less than 10% of this external financing of the 60 billion. So even if the World Bank Group doubles, even if the EIB doubles, it's still not enough. And therefore, what we need to do is to see how we can get more financing. And I'd say the encouraging development here at the COP is this coalition of finance ministers, because we will need to have finance ministers around to create better incentives in the countries themselves so that there is domestic and private investment occurring. Secondly, green financing has to be incorporated into public fiscal policy, be it on the expenditure side, be it on the revenue side, and then particularly a sharp focus on incentives. But one thing we should not forget is while we are talking and while we are mobilizing, people are hurting, from the Sahel to the small island state in the Pacific or the Caribbean. So many need help now, and there is a poverty impact. Our estimates, if we don't do enough, we will see poverty increasing by another 100 million by the end of the next decade. So I think in our considerations, we cannot only limit ourselves to financial technical solutions. This will be a sine qua non. but we need to keep the social dimension and the poverty dimension in sharp focus, because this is going to affect many people in Africa and low-income countries when you think of the Bangladeshis of this world. And therefore, also World Bank group financing. And I think also in the EU, we need more climate financing, but that should not be a substitution exercise that we do less for development. We need both. And I think we need to keep that in mind. We need to reinforce commitment for development as well as climate change. And I think this is the joint challenge we will have to take forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our fifth speaker is Angus Taylor. He's an energy minister in Australia. Before his appointment, he was Minister for Law Enforcement and Cybersecurity. He's a Liberal member of the House of Representatives. And before that, he made partner at the consulting company McKinsey. Mr. Taylor.
Thank you. And can I join the other panellists in thanking Spain on your record effort of putting this together. It's extraordinary how you've achieved it. And thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for this panel today. Look, I think this whole issue of how we attract finance into solving this very significant problem comes back to a really basic point, which is we have to make the economics work. The economics has to work for financiers and businesses, and the economics has to work for the public. Both are important. And this is essentially what we've been grappling with in Australia in how we've approached this, which is to look for opportunities where we can abate at low cost and under $20 a tonne, which has been our focus. We very hard numbers on this and very hard issue in how we approach it, because the public will accept that. And making sure then that financiers have investments that are bankable, that they understand the numbers, the information that Michael Bloomberg was talking about earlier, absolutely crucial. But you have to ultimately be able to put the numbers in a spreadsheet and get the investment to work. And it's very hard practical stuff that makes the difference. Now, we've done this in a number of ways in Australia. We have a climate solutions fund of a couple of $2 billion on top of an emissions reduction fund we set up many years ago, which is all about sending the signal to financiers that there's an investment here that can get a return. And the government has achieved hundreds of millions of tonnes of emissions reductions at costs of under $15 a tonne. And we measure that very, very carefully, because the public will accept that. It's a price they're prepared to pay at that level. But secondly, we recognise there is a role for public finance to play in this, a role. We want as much private sector finance as possible, but we've seen this as, particularly in new areas where the information is not clear, there's a role for public finance, and we've established a Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which has invested just over $7 billion in abatement projects across a whole range of different sectors, all of which are relatively low-cost abatement projects, and have attracted in turn a total of $20 billion of investment in those projects. Alongside that, we see an important role for venture capital. And there are a lot of technologies here that are not yet at that sub $20 a tonne stage. They're not yet at a level where we know they can be deployed and rolled out and scaled up without very significant costs. And the key here is venture capital. There's no question government has a role to play in this. We're particularly focused on hydrogen. We think it has enormous potential. We've put together a project recently, $50 million of government capital alongside $450 million of capital from outside of the federal government in a major deployment of hydrogen technology to try and get those costs down to a level which is going to make it highly competitive. So ultimately it is economics. It all comes back to the economics. We've had some real success. It's going to get harder. We know that. And it is absolutely crucial now to continue to work on how we make the economics work, not just for the financiers, but for the public as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Minister Taylor. Our final speaker is Anna Botín. She's the executive chairman of Santander Group, which always pops to the top of Bloomberg league tables when it comes to lending on clean energy. And she's arguably at the heart of what we're trying to talk about here, a commercial bank who's active in lending into the clean energy space. She built up her career working in various positions in Latin America and started at JP Morgan in New York, She led Santander's operation in Latin America for some time. Anna Botín.
Thank you. We are also at the top of Bloomberg's Global Gender Equality Index. Very important. And we're very proud of it. So I think everything has been said, but I think I'd like to summarize how the private sector can help. First is that at the end, it's about, we know what works, we know more or less what we have to do. It's about how do you mobilize and direct trillions of dollars of finance? How do you mobilize billions of people to make green choices? And at the end, Michael Bloomberg said it, it's about governments and business leadership. How do you really align the world? And this is what we are talking about. And it's not a small feat. It's probably not easier than sending a man to the moon or many other things we've done, because it's about getting the world to agree. And we know that is very hard. So, I'd say on the first part, in terms of how do you get the trillions of capital, it's about supply and demand, as the minister said. So on the supply side, liquidity is there, capital is there, let's say more or less, and the third is key because it's the risk. And I think the best way to explain this is an example. So Santander is a leader, as you said, in green finance, and it's not by chance. It's because our government, more than a decade ago, made a bet for clean energy. So I remember when we started to get requests to finance offshore wind, the risks were not assumable by the private sector. We have shareholders, and people, we have to make sure get a dividend. So the government gave us some incentives. Today, it's the most popular, financing in terms of renewals in wind. We're financing hundreds of projects. So I think that is one. In terms of capital, how do you make the risk assumable by the private sector? And I'd say also for this, it's been said also, data and taxonomy are key. And I applaud, and it's, as a European, very proud that we're taking the lead. But if the world doesn't agree, we're just going to put European financing entities out of business because somebody else is going to come and do it. So we have a big bank in Poland. Poland is 80% coal. We've said we will not finance new coal-fired plants. But we cannot just stop financing coal in Poland. So again, when the taxonomy gets made, we need to consider the social and the community effects of the transition. The second thing I think is important, going to the people and choices, because a market economy works on incentives. Again, let me give you an example. When I arrived at Santander, we launched a Be Healthy program for our employees. If you eat animal protein once a day, you can save a lot of emissions. And so these are the kind of things that if you make individuals, understand that this is the right choice and they have to make it freely. So I think we need to align all of these. But very importantly, at the end, we come back to leadership. We have been the most sustainable bank in the world. We need the others to step up. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to compete. And let me say something else to finish and this is a Bloomberg issue, by the way. When I get asked what is the hardest thing about my job, is aligning the short term and the medium term. But as long as companies like mine have to report every quarter and investors are only looking at our latest profit numbers, this ain't going to work. So we need companies like Bloomberg and media and investors to give us more credit for investing sustainably. So let me leave it there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anna Botín. I think at this point I'm going to run through questions for each one of the panelists quickly. Hopefully we'll get shorter answers and we can take more questions, and with luck we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. Going back to Nadia Calviño, as a legislator, what are the challenges you find in unlocking green finance and getting money moving? And what can your friends at the European Commission and EIB do to help?
Well, I think that we're facing, first of all, we need to strike the right balance here. When we're discussing, just to give an example, the taxonomy, I think getting the principles right is perfect, but then when you get down to the details, how do you treat coal? You were just talking about that. How do we consider gas? Is it green? Is it transition? Is it brown? When you get down to the details, there is a risk that you don't get the transition right, and there is also a risk that we get lost in the details, and we lose sight of the big picture. So I think that we're striking the right balance, but there is when you legislate, there is don't get carried away to try to make things perfect. We need to get going and then see how it progresses. Likewise, when I see so many initiatives taking place having to do with bank regulation or insurance regulation, we need to see to make progress step by step. We're not going to get there in the first go. And then the second key challenge I think we have, which has been mentioned by previous speakers, is to bring the people with us. If we don't make sure that this transition is a fair transition, that nobody's left behind, that citizens, as you were very rightly explaining, that the citizens can accept and deal with the costs, and that we are able to articulate the short term, the investment needs, and the long term, the benefits, many of which are going to go to our children and grandchildren. But we need to get this intergeneration fairness issue right, because otherwise we can see very strong social tensions. We're already seeing them, frankly, in a number of countries. I think that as politicians and as legislators and policymakers, this is going to be the key challenge for us, to get the technique right, but to get the politics right. Otherwise, the backlash can be huge, and we may not be able to achieve those goals. That is why I was saying before, it can be like nirvana. No, it's perfect, but it's almost impossible to reach,
Thank you very much. Commissioner Dombrovskis, you've got a very ambitious green plan coming out tomorrow, the new Green Deal, and also the EU summit later this week is probably going to agree a net zero commitment. These are really ambitious programs on the climate. What difficulties do you see in implementing this? Where are the friction points coming from? I wonder if you can talk about what you expect going on.
I think some of the potential friction points had already been discussed also today. Well, one is that we'll need to mobilize sufficient amount of investment, and it concerns both public funding, so we are looking what can be done at the public level. For example, also when we are discussing next multi-annual EU budget from 2021 to 2027, we aim at 25% devoted to sustainability. We will need to mobilize private finance, but of course for this we will need to address lots of obstacles which are coming. And what a number of colleagues already raised, this transition will have to be socially fair, socially acceptable, so that when we are discussing movement to the carbon neutral economy, we need to make sure that we take care of the sectors and regions and people which are affected by this transition. A number of colleagues mentioned coal regions. Indeed, we need to make sure that this transition is accepted by the people. And for that, in parallel with our European Green Deal, with our Sustainable Europe Investment Plan and other activities, we are also setting up what we call Just Transition Fund to do exactly this, to make sure that we support those people and regions which are going to be affected by this transition. So I think that's a key point, that this transition will have to be acceptable for a society, and in Europe we will need to do the green and I would say also digital transition in a way that preserves our European social market economy model.
Very much. President Hoyer, I write about renewable energy, and I know that the space is absolutely crowded with private lenders like Anna Botín. There's pension funds, there's insurances coming in. I just wonder if you can talk about where the EIB's stake is in that segment. Where can the EIB make the biggest difference what sort of projects need your backing that the commercial banks are more afraid to lend against?
Whenever Santander and Anna are investing into something, then we are not needed. And I'm convinced that a public bank should intervene if the private sector cannot get it done alone. So, yes, and the tricky thing is, however, that very often the fact that EIB is a largely engineers-driven bank leads to the fact that when we do the due diligence on a project and our technicians, our engineers, our natural scientists come to the conclusion this thing is sustainable and it's economically viable, then all of a sudden private investors want to join. So that's a good way of cooperating between the private sector and a public institution. But I have no ambition at all to compete with Santander. That's not our job. We must bring the value added, the additionality of a public institution. And on the other hand, since we are refinanced completely on the capital market because our shareholders have always been extremely clumsy in giving us cash, so we need to be a trustworthy partner on the capital markets, which gives us 70 to 90 billion euros in bond purchases every year, and they want their money back. So they need to rely upon a strong AAA institution like EIB, and that's the trick.
Thank you very much. Mr. von Trotzenberg, the biggest challenge in attracting private capital to the energy transition is getting all the banks to go and the policymakers all lined up together. Can you name something about the process you'd like to change? Something that you'd like from national policymakers or commercial banks that would free up more capital?
Well, I think there are a couple of challenges. First of all, I think the biggest challenge is probably on the policy front in Asia. If you're looking at their energy plans, in most of the Asian countries, it's still very much coal-based. So this is the biggest challenge. If we can make a dent on this, we make progress. So that is, I think, I would put there squarely the first priority. Secondly, I think that it is indeed the art to look, as Werner Hoyer said, is how multilateral development banks can be complementary to the private sector and using MDBs for two things, for policy reform in the countries and those investments where the private sector is not going to take place. And then third is clearly you have to differentiate between, of course, a Vietnam or in Indonesia and then African countries. And I think Annabelle Botin mentioned the whole issue about risk. So where we need to come in, particularly in the low-income countries with de-risking devices for the private sector. In order to make this happen, because we can talk here very long about cute instruments, but if the risk is simply too high, it will not happen. So that we have to do. Finally, we need to keep a balance between the mitigation and adaptation agenda. And when I mentioned this 600 billion earlier to the developing countries, only 30 billion 35% is on adaptation. That's not good enough. It will need ultimately to raise. The MDBs are trying to do that. Our goal, and we have been achieving, is a 50-50 balance. But that is a work in progress. We need the adaptation agenda to make up. Final remark is, it is incredibly important how you change the mindset in every organization that every project is going to look through a climate change lens on how you can contribute. So this is also a cultural change of all institutions, because otherwise it won't happen. And that is where our challenges are.
Thank you very much. I think that's a good time to bring in Angus Taylor. I think he was talking about you when he was talking about economies that are dependent on coal. Yours is a very resource-rich economy, heavy in mining and natural resources. What challenges do you face in shifting capital from those industries over to the green industries and the cleaner energy?
Well, it's a bigger issue than that, because it's also about making sure those industries are able to drive abatement. So our biggest export is iron ore, and one of the hardest industries you can find to drive abatement is the steel industry supply chain. So we have to find those new technologies and make them work in those industries. And I think the really big challenge here is between the emergence of a new technology which has promise, which is still high cost and hasn't been deployed or scaled up, and crossing the chasm to being a technology which is widely deployed, which is relatively low cost versus the alternatives. And that process requires public finance, it requires venture capital, it requires a great deal of work, information sharing, and that is really where the hard work is to be done. And a good example of that I mentioned earlier is hydrogen. We see enormous potential there in industries like steel, but we have to cross the chasm, and that's the work that I think globally we have to take much more time and effort in helping those technologies through those early stages to the point where they're ready for wide-scale economic deployment.
Thank you very much. Anna Botín, you'll have the last word on the major. You're a major lender for renewable energy, and from your perspective, what difficulties do you face in banking for this sector? Where are the friction points that you have, and what can the policymakers of the EIB do to help?
So again, I mean, so for us, for the market economy to finance, you need supply and demand to work, and you need the risk to be acceptable. So we are not in the business, banks, financial institutions, of innovation. I think innovation has to happen. By the way, I was in Greenland this summer with a top scientist, Jason Box, and he said everything we do from now on is not going to be enough unless we find new technologies to capture carbon. So somebody has to be doing that, and that's probably academia and the public sector. But we also need to, once the technology is proven, if it's not economic or the risks are too much, that's why we need the World Bank EIB, and that's going to continue. Because it's not just the technology is proven, it's the regulatory risk. What about if regulators change their minds? What about if governments change the incentives? By the way, that's happened here in my country. So it's super important that we de-risk proven technology so we can finance them in an acceptable way. And I spoke about renewables in Spain. It's a great example. So I think that is super crucial. And I think the combination of individual, business, and governments' commitments to mitigate, but also to adapt, as you were saying. And, the taxonomy, we keep on going back to that. What is green? I'm trying to measure my own carbon footprint, and the European Union doesn't consider, if you take care of a forest, that doesn't count. If you planted trees 15 years ago and you were a good citizen, it doesn't count. It only counts from 2012. These are the things that are not easy on the detail, but we must get right. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult for us to put more financing on the table. And so, again, data and taxonomy, clear rules, but also de-risking so we can finance more. And here is where super important multilateral institutions are going to be key, because you do have the AAA rating and you're supposed to, you're beyond government. So it doesn't matter what government is in place, we trust that you're going to be there for our investors.
Okay, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've run to the end of our time. I'd like to thank the panelists for showing up. It's really important to hear from a variety of financiers about how to unlock private capital for this industry. So I'd like to give everybody a big round of applause. The next session is starting at 11, shortly after this. It'll focus on taxonomy, green bonds, and disclosures, and the need for coherent frameworks. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, cheers.